Welcome to Constellations, the podcast from Kratos, where industry leaders share their thoughts and experience on the future of space business, policy, and opportunity. If you like Constellations, please support us by giving a rating and review on iTunes. And don't forget to share this podcast online to help our community grow.
Welcome to Constellations, the podcast from Kratos. My name is John Gilroy, and I'll be your moderator. Our guest today is Daniel Ceperley, CEO and co-founder of LeoLabs Space. Today we'll talk conjunctions. No, not the reason you failed high school English. We'll talk about how to apply innovation to solving the problem of space debris. Orbital debris is a serious issue that will only get worse, but dealing with it is as much an opportunity as a challenge. This is an area well known to LeoLabs, as they are building a set of advanced radars dedicated to tracking the 12,000 known debris objects in low Earth orbit, or LEO. LeoLabs' core technology includes a patent-pending global phased array radar network, which tracks debris and satellites in LEO. Observations generated from this network inform the LeoLabs platform with timely and accurate orbital and situational data. Currently, LeoLabs offers 10 times the precision at 1 time the cost of traditional methods. Dan, that sounds like the very definition of innovation, doesn't it?
Yes, I completely agree. We're in the business now because we're bringing an innovative new technology to market. So we're building out a global network of phased array radars. Keep an eye on all that new activity, all those new satellites going into space, and also all the debris. And we're going to be tracking a lot of the small stuff that's never been tracked before. So absolutely, I think we're doing something very disruptive on the technology side, but also on the business side. We're pairing a new business model with this technology. And specifically, that's the software as a service model. So you can actually subscribe to information about your satellites or subscribe to debris information to make your satellites more safe. And that's never been done before. So we're really excited to be pursuing.
There's a guy named Kevin O'Connell. You probably heard about him. He's a director of the Office of Space Commerce. He said in testimony before the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation downtown here, United States Senate, that this year alone there may be over 1,000 new satellites launched into low Earth orbit, increasing the number of active satellites by almost 50%. What type of technology is out there to track all these satellites, Dan?
Yeah, so it's a really exciting time in the space industry. You know, people talk about it as a gold rush. The price to build a satellite, the price to launch a satellite, the ease of getting these satellites up there, it just means there's a whole lot of new activity, and there's a lot of new companies pursuing business models based on satellites. It provides a method of accessing the entire globe, getting real-time information anywhere in the world or from anywhere in the world. And it's attracted the notice of a lot of investors. So they're putting a lot of money into it. So that number is going up dramatically. I think 3 years ago, the number of active satellites in low Earth orbit was about 600. And right now, I think we're at about 1,800. And so that's 3x higher in just a few years. And it's still continuing to grow. I think the space industry is just going to keep growing and growing because these satellite applications are quite transformative. So that, of course, means we have to really take a hard look at how do you keep all this stuff safe? If there's more satellites going in up there and there's already a lot of man-made debris, how do you make sure there aren't more collisions, there aren't more mishaps, or even just how to organize it more intelligently? And the foundation for all of that work is data. So data on where's the satellite, where's the debris, and that's something that really hasn't been available before. So the primary way of tracking most of these objects has been radars and telescopes run by defense organizations. And the U.S. Air Force, now the U.S. Space Force, was really the leader and has been for a number of years in publishing data, providing a foundation for kind of safe navigation, safety of flight. But even they are not allowed to disclose the full range of their data, the full precision, because they're a military organization. They've got to protect their secrets. And so that's why we got into the business. There was a big need for more data, better data, and on top of that, really services, interactive services. And so we're now in the business of getting those customized services out there for specific operators, specific missions, and really broadening the reach of these sorts of services. So if you rewind about 10 years, the primary use for tracking satellites, tracking debris was for defense. But now that there's a huge number of commercial operators in LEO, all these commercial operators need precise information. And because there's a lot of new commercial satellites, the regulators need a lot of information about what's going on. And ultimately, we think the insurance industry is going to need a lot of information about what is the risk that their portfolios face. And so there's this need for a commercial source of data that is able to be disseminated very broadly and used in all sorts of new applications.
We can talk about the number of satellites, and we're just doing it verbally in a podcast. Sometimes you have this visual image that really punches through. And This morning I was at platform.leolabs.space/visualization. Wow, it just overwhelms you, the number of orbits and satellites out there. It really brings home the point, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And we very early on got that visualization up on the web so people can see the latest 24 hours in low Earth orbit. So yeah, I encourage anybody, go to that website. There's actually a little search bar in the upper left where you can pull out individual satellites like the space station, or you can pull out satellite constellations like Planet has got a big one, SpaceX and Starlink has got a big one. Or you can zoom in on some of the debris items too, rocket bodies, debris left over from other activities. To give you a sense of the numbers, I mentioned a moment ago, there's about 1,800 active satellites in low Earth orbit. Well, there's about 14,000, bit more now, pieces of debris and satellites tracked. So 14,000 man-made objects that are tracked in low Earth orbit. And those are the objects that are about 4 inches or 10 centimeters in size. And that's kind of the industry standard right now. So there's way more debris than there are active satellites, unfortunately. And that debris is going to be up there for a long time, decades, even centuries. On top of that, there's a lot of small stuff that we really have to be careful of. It turns out that even down to 2 centimeters in size, an object has so much energy, it's moving so fast that if it hits your satellite, it's got the energy of a hand grenade. So it'll shatter your satellite and create a new cloud of debris. And then that debris is up there threatening your other satellites, other people's satellites. And so that small stuff, there's about 250,000 pieces of it. That's the best estimates right now. So 20 times more small stuff that's not even tracked as there is tracked stuff today. So if you're going to get hit, it's going to be by a piece of small debris. And so that's one of the big things that LeoLabs we're doing, is rolling out a new generation of radars that can track all that small stuff.
Well, Dan, I'm going to ask a Joe Sixpack question here. 2 centimeters, you can't put a license plate on 2 centimeters. I mean, how can you identify uniquely each one of these objects? Is there a way to do it?
Yeah, so when it comes to the small debris, it's all about tracking it frequently. So you see it going over one radar, and you can pretty precisely tell where it's going to be for the next couple of days. So when we track something, we know better than 100 meters, or better than the size of like a football field, where that object is going to be at all times. And that enables us to say, when we see that object again, to with a lot of confidence say, this is the same object. It's not a different piece of debris. And so being able to check in on it daily or even many times per day is really critical. That enables you to keep up with it and not get confused about whether it's one object or the other. And that's actually something that's really not been available before. There's a need for just a lot more sensors, a lot more radars to keep track of everything. And so one of the big things we're doing is rolling out those radars. In fact, we're the only organization that's demonstrated being able to build one of these radars in less than a year. We've actually built 2 in less than a year. So we did it in Texas and we did it in New Zealand, and we're going to continue and roll out at least 3 more of these radars. But to your point about identification, there's also another challenge of identifying newly launched satellites. And, those things, they're a lot larger, but these days they tend to be kind of launched together. And while from the radar, you can't precisely say, hey, this is that satellite, this is satellite A, this is satellite B. You can get a size. So you can say, hey, here are the large satellites, here are the smaller satellites. And you can also keep close track of it so that you don't start switching satellites and say, it was this satellite today. I'm not sure if it's another satellite tomorrow. Keeping close track of things enables us to avoid any confusion.
When I introduced you to this podcast, I used the phrase phased array radar. It sounded like Star Trek or something. What a phrase. So what do you mean by phased array radar? Is it different from the traditional radar dishes, or what is it anyway?
Yeah, it's actually really critical. The phased array part is what enables us to do our job. So by phased array, we mean there's no moving parts. It's all electronically steered. So quite often, and if you say watch the movie Contact, they've got these big dishes, and the dishes slowly move around. Those dishes are one way to do a radar. The big challenge you have there is you lose a lot of time when you're moving that dish around. So, you go and track one satellite, and it can take a few minutes to move that dish and then go track another satellite or another piece of debris. We don't have that much time because it turns out there's thousands of objects going over each radar every hour. So every millisecond, you have to switch from one object to another, piece of debris, satellite, piece of debris, and back. And that's what the phased array lets us do. So when we build a phased array radar, we have a few hundred identical electronics units or electronics modules, and they all act as kind of their own compact radar. And by carefully timing them all so that they're all working together, we can actually have the radar say, look to the east, and then a millisecond later, look to the west. And it's all that steering is done electronically, so we can very rapidly switch between the objects and keep up with that heavy amount of traffic going overhead. It's also important to note that radar is quite critical. So when we're talking about low Earth orbit, which is where most of the activity is, all the new satellites, all the astronauts and the like, you have to be tracking around the clock. Satellites are going over in the middle of the day. They're going over during the dead of night. They're going over when there's bad weather, when there's rain or clouds or snow, and you have to keep tracking during that time. Radar can do that. Radar is not affected by sunlight. It's not affected by clouds. And that's why we've chosen radars, and that's why we've chosen phased array radars for this particular task.
Dan, there are a number of shared ride launches these days. I think everyone knows that. Trade publications talk about it. Is it possible to track multiple objects being launched in the sky at the same time? I mean, you see dozens of satellites going out there. Seems like it'd be confusing, wouldn't it?
So that is actually one of the biggest challenges right now in the industry is you get these rideshare launches where there's a bunch of satellites on them. They deliver a whole bunch of satellites all at once into space. And then there's a few week time where satellite operators have to find their satellite, get in touch with their satellite, and basically turn it on. And many times, if they don't boot the satellite up in a few days, the batteries are dead and it's game over. And I think the statistics are pretty bad for these really small satellites, these CubeSats, that something like 25% of them are in effect dead on arrival because it's, in a large part, it's hard to find them and get in touch with them. And that's where the precision of the tracking data, it becomes quite important. You need to know precisely which satellite is which, when's it going to go over my ground station, how do I get in touch with it? And so that's a big area that we're focused on. And yes, we can absolutely track all those satellites as they come off the launch. We've done this with a number of rideshare launches, and actually just recently on June 13th, we worked with our friends at Planet, who put 3 of their SkySats on top of a SpaceX Starlink mission, delivered those satellites to space, and a couple hours after they were dropped off, we tracked them and delivered that tracking data to Planet. So one of the big benefits we have is we directly control our radars, so we can actually set aside a fair amount of time to make sure we're tracking these new launches. So we stare at the point of the sky where those satellites are going to fly over our radar, and we start watching a little bit early, a couple minutes early, keep watching until it's a few minutes late, go after the pass, just to make sure that we see all of those objects. And then we fit the orbits to them, and we can predict where those satellites are going. And again, we can also see the sizes. So we can tell you, there's the big satellites. Those are the main payloads. And, there's the small satellites. Those are the CubeSats. And there's a few in between. Those are the small sats. And with that kind of precise information and that comprehensive picture of what's been delivered in space, we can cut down a lot of the confusion.
When you talked about cube satellites being lost, I thought about a new application for the phrase lost in space. It's the undergraduate satellites out there lost in space, and Professor Dan's got to help them out, find it somehow, huh?
Yes, absolutely. We want to make the lost in space thing a thing of the past.
Yeah.
Right. The new norm is simply sign up for the service. As soon as your satellite gets dropped off in space, we track it. You know where it is. You can, in that visualization you talked about on the web, where you see all the debris and all the satellites, we have a version of that actually shows only the satellites operated by a specific company. So in fact, it's now even an off-the-shelf service to just have this dashboard. It says, where are my satellites now? And we even have some companies that have it on their webpage that show, hey, here's our fleet. Here's where they are, and this is the latest tracking information from LeoLabs verifying that they're in their orbits, and if you need to know when they're going to go overhead, here's the data.
You know, Daniel, thousands of people from all over the world have listened to this podcast. If you're listening now, you can go to Google and type in Constellations Podcast to get our show notes page. Here you can get transcripts from all 78 interviews. Also, you can sign up for free email notifications for future podcasts where we talk about Lost in Space. Maybe that'll be the theme of the show, or not Lost in Space. That would be the theme of your company. So,
yes.
How many people are keeping an eye on this? How many people are looking at the space traffic? Anyone? Just you?
Yeah. So in a way, it really is the Wild West. Companies, they launch their satellites, and then by and large, they're each tracking their own satellites. The U.S. Air Force keeps a pretty comprehensive eye, or the U.S. Space Force now keeps a pretty comprehensive eye on the satellites and the debris, and they share some information as well. But one of the big changes we're seeing is there's a lot more discussion about what should the rules of the road be? How should space traffic safety be defined, and what should be reported on, what should be monitored? And I think there's two opportunities here. Certainly there's an opportunity for LeoLabs and companies like LeoLabs to be this tracking service provider, to roll out more sensors, roll out advanced services, to provide very detailed information about satellites and the activities in space. But there's also a need for a government regulatory body to kind of step into a new role, and that is to really define what it means to be safe in space, to monitor what is going on in space, and in the beginning, simply report on it. What activities look completely safe, especially the new ones? Hey, which new ones are actually going really well? We should do more of that. We should license more of these satellites. And maybe which ones look a little risky? They're not going as we planned. They look like they're creating some risk. We need to go back to the drawing board and update them. Right now, there's just not that much certainty around, hey, how is space traffic safety defined? If I'm building a satellite constellation or designing a new satellite, what should I take into account? And so that's a new need for an agency that does this. And it really has just come up in the last few years because of this rise of a lot of new companies that are delivering satellites to space or that are providing launches and rides to space. And I kind of think about it a little bit like almost the stock market and the public markets, that there's a need for somebody kind of like the SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission, somebody who's setting the rules and talking about what activities are in compliance and which ones aren't. And then those day-to-day operations, steering the satellites, driving the satellites, planning satellite operations, leave that to the private sector and the companies who are flying the satellites and services like LeoLabs that are providing the information going into that process.
In my world, they toss around this phrase, predictive analytics. It sounds pretty impressive.
Oh, yeah.
And I would think that with all this mathematical information you have now, you'd be able to forecast something out. Is it a matter of days, a matter of months, or can you forecast these potential collisions?
Yeah, so very good question. And actually very timely, because in early May, we launched our newest service, our collision avoidance service. And that sends out alerts to satellite operators about potential collisions. And it sends them out up to a week in advance, because it turns out the way these satellite operators work, they want the first inklings, the first information that there's a risk about a week in advance. And then they watch the situation develop for a few days. And about 2 to 3 days before the collision, or before what they call the time of closest approach, they make a decision about whether they're going to maneuver or not. And in part, they don't need to maneuver before then. There's plenty of time, 2 to 3 days out. But also in part because the predictions, it's a little hard to make a prediction 7 days in the future, because it turns out there's a little bit of atmosphere in space. Just the trace amounts of air push the satellites and the debris around just enough that if you're looking 7 days out or even further, you don't precisely know, hey, is there really going to be a collision or is there not going to be a collision? But about 2 to 3 days out, you're confident enough that, hey, this is going to be too close for comfort, or this is going to be completely harmless. It's going to pass very far away. And so our CA service, our collision avoidance service, sends them those alerts in advance. And then actually in the days leading up to the close approach, it sends them a few more updates every single day. Like every time we get some new radar data, they get an update. And the service also has a feature where they're able to send us essentially maneuver plans. Hey, if I maneuver my satellite here, if I put it on a slightly different orbit, am I going to get rid of the risk? And our service immediately responds with updated risk information, so that the people who are planning these maneuvers, planning the satellite operations, when they're in a meeting, they can just be hitting us with multiple maneuver plans and getting answers back. Oh, look, this one's safe, this one's not. And you can get to a final answer. The challenge has been in the industry in the past, this sort of service has been on a very fixed schedule that you can submit a request and about 8 hours later, you get a response. You say, oh, if you follow this plan, here's the new risks you might face. So we've changed that. We've made this a modern responsive service. You get an answer back within seconds. And so that means you can actually start to kind of play out, pregame the situation, try different plans, and find one that works.
So, Dan, you can see I have a whiteboard behind me. And you're in this room here, and you're drawing this, and there's a potential collision, and you're happy, I'm happy. And what happens when they run out of gas? What if there's no fuel to avoid the collision? I mean, just sit here and enjoy it? Or, I mean, that can possibly happen, couldn't it?
Yeah, so you touch on a very interesting point. And it generally comes up kind of in the topic of derelict satellites. So one of the sort of rules of the road right now is that when your satellite's at its end of mission, which can be, hey, it's maybe some of the solar panels are failing, or it could be it's out of gas. The satellite's essentially retired, but it's left in space. And the rules right now say you have to set it up so that the satellite leaves space. It burns up in the atmosphere within 25 years. But that's a pretty long time. That means there's a lot of derelict satellites in space. Those satellites can run into other satellites during that time, or they could get hit by debris, other pieces of debris, and themselves get turned into a cloud of debris and pose risk to other satellites. So there's some notion that maybe that requirement needs to be changed. Maybe these satellites need to be moved out of space faster, or if you're at certain altitudes or you're deploying certain numbers of satellites, you need to get them out of space more quickly. But I don't think there's consensus yet. And that's actually where some direction from some of these regulatory agencies could be quite useful. We saw an example of this in late January. We actually tweeted out that there was a near miss between two satellites. One of them was an old or actually two old U.S. satellites, one from the 1960s and one from the 1980s. And they passed within 50 meters of one another. And they're very large satellites. So if they'd hit, there would have been thousands of new pieces of debris. There would have been a substantial increase in the collision risk in low Earth orbit. And those satellites, luckily they missed. We didn't have a collision situation. It was a big relief. But those sorts of situations happen every week. These old defunct satellites and old defunct rocket bodies are passing close to one another. So with our data, we're working to quantify, hey, just how much risk is this? What is the riskiest kind of orbits to be in? What are the riskiest satellites? And what do we do about it? So you can certainly update the regulations so that future satellites pose less of a risk. But you also want to get into a situation where maybe you start removing those satellites. You start reducing the risk. And that's an area of the space industry I'm really interested in. So active debris removal. And there's some companies that have been started that aim to provide that service. Go up, grab a piece of debris, drag it down into the atmosphere and burn it up. And I think for the health of the space industry, we're going to need to get to the point where that's routine, that sort of service is routine. And I hope our data can really help them close their business case, that we can provide the actuarial information that they can use to justify the cost of the mission.
Dan, earlier in the interview, you talked about software as a service, kind of in my tech world, that's used all the time. So in order to coin a phrase here, so what we're talking about here is maybe orbital debris tracking as a service? Is that what we're talking about then?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we present ourselves as a SaaS company, software as a service company. And so the way you access our services is a subscription, a monthly subscription or an annual subscription. And you sign up for the specific satellites you need to track, your fleet of satellites. And you sign up for the specific services you need. So maybe it's precise tracking information. Maybe it's these collision alerts. And then you access it over the internet. So we have an application program interface. So you can your software engineers can make very small modifications to the software you use, connect to our data feed, and just pull our information over the internet in real time. And we also have a set of online dashboards. So you can log into our website and get these displays. And we have a team that's making some really great 3D displays that, in the example of a collision, show the two objects coming together and just how close the potential collision or the conjunction is going to be. And more importantly, give you reporting tools. So we have what we think is the first kind of modern reporting tool for space traffic safety. So you can get these reports and these displays that you can share with other stakeholders like company management or the investors or other satellite operators who might be in the vicinity. And the information is presented in this way that's easy to digest so people can get to precisely what they need. So we're a SaaS company, but we also happen to be backed by a network of radars. So we're rolling out this infrastructure that produces all this data, but people access it through a subscription. So our users, they don't have to become radar experts. They don't have to worry about, say, maintaining a radar or building a radar or even processing a lot of the data. They just get that end product that they need, that alert or that report or that dashboard, and they can just go on with their daily lives. And we're in the background worrying about those radars and adding more radars and adding more advanced analytics to the mix.
So, Dan, let me put you behind the steering wheel of a car. You're driving down the street, and a watermelon falls off a truck in front of you. You veer out of the way, yes, and you hit the car coming at you. And so I can see this happening in space, So your LeoLab says, look, you got a potential collision. Good luck. I mean, there's got to be some kind of here's some options for avoidance, or maybe there's some simulations. What if I did this? You touched on this earlier. It seems to be an important part of the whole story here.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. And so, in terms of collision avoidance, we're a critical piece of preventing the collisions, but we're not the end story, because ultimately the satellite operator has to decide when they're going to maneuver and if they're going to maneuver and how they're going to do it. And it turns out actually the satellite operators don't want to hand over control of the steering wheel to us, to LeoLab, because when they make a decision to maneuver, they're not only avoiding a collision, but they're also impacting their schedule. They've got a schedule for when do I get to collect more data? Maybe it's images of the ground. I've got a set of images I got to collect over the next day. They've also got a schedule for when can they downlink data. I've got to download all this data I collected, and I'm only going to be over the teleports during this time. And so they've got all these things considerations they have to take into the mix. And then our information is a critical piece of that. But we try to make the job as easy as possible. So rather than simply providing them this kind of static information that, you've got a potential collision coming up, you've got that watermelon, it's sitting in the road ahead of you, you've got to maneuver around it. We've got this interactive service where they can say, all right, what if I swerve at this time? Or what if I swerve at this other time? Or, what if I go down this side street? They can send us all those what ifs, and we'll run them against the entire data set, against every single satellite and every single piece of debris we're tracking, and tell them if they're not only avoiding the watermelon, but avoiding everything else, avoiding that, other satellite coming down the, in the oncoming lane of traffic, avoiding something else that's sitting on a side road. So when we say we're doing maneuver screening, it's not just against that watermelon, that one object. It's against everything we're seeing in LEO. And it's been a lot of work on our side and our software engineering team to really make that happen, to make it so you can get an answer back about the entire set of stuff in LEO in only a few seconds. It's not trivial, but with cloud computing and with the algorithm development we've done, we're very proud to say that we can get you those answers quickly.
Sit down with your really brainiac staff and say, the goal of this company is to make sure things aren't lost in space and how to avoid the watermelon, kind of both ways on both ends of the collision, huh?
I like it. Yeah, I haven't heard about the watermelon in space yet, but I guess it was the cheese wheel that SpaceX put up a while ago. So we've got some precedent.
Yeah. Well, Daniel, I loved hearing about the success from someone from the University of Virginia. I'd like to thank our guest, Dan Ceperley, CEO and co-founder of LeoLabs Space.
John, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I really appreciate the time. So thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Constellations, the podcast from Kratos. If you like this interview, please subscribe, tell a friend, and give us a review.